Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. It's a pretty extraordinary sight. I've never sat on this stage with so many people here. It's amazing to be here. Welcome. Good afternoon and welcome to this conversation with my friend and colleague, Peter Greste. Please welcome him now. I think this might go all right.
This is extraordinary. Terrifying, but extraordinary.
Dangerous ideas. Why is journalism a dangerous idea? When I set out in journalism 41 years ago, you wouldn't have thought that it was a dangerous idea. Journalists could be annoying to politicians. They could be, they could put themselves in positions of danger because, for instance, at that time the Vietnam War was still going on. But those dangers were very clear, and you were not, as a journalist, the target because you were a journalist. When I was a foreign correspondent for quite a long time, and when I was a foreign correspondent, I very seldom felt in danger because I was a journalist. I had dangerous moments at roadblocks and things like that, and a couple of times when I was actually close to a front line and was fired at, but I was in danger because of where I was and not because I had a press card. That started to change in the Balkans War, when suddenly being press started to mean actually being a target. It was at that time, for instance, that journalists for the first time started driving around in what were called, you started to categorize cars as soft skin or soft shell and hard shell, so that journalists started to go around in armoured Land Rovers because journalists were being shot at deliberately because they were journalists. And over the last few years, that was in the 90s, of course, and through the 2000s and into this decade, it has ratcheted up, it has ramped up. Journalists are now not only a target, but they are the targets of people who would like to take them hostage for large sums of money, and there have been a lot of those. Syria and Iraq are some of the most dangerous places in the world, that they're probably in world history for a journalist to work. And as we sit here, we should remember that there are journalists in danger, not only, like Peter, of losing their freedom, but of losing their lives in many places all over the world. For instance, in Mexico, where I think hundreds now have been killed by a strange web combination of the narco syndicates, the government, the police, and the military. There are journalists under fire, literally under fire, losing their lives for their job all over the world, and that's why journalism is a dangerous idea. And none of this is to minimize in any way what happened to Peter. Peter was locked up in an Egyptian prison, or more than one prison, for more than a year for doing his job as a journalist, and not even for doing a job that in olden days we would have thought of as particularly dangerous. You were basically doing a bread and butter job when it happened.
Yeah, this is something actually I'm almost a little bit embarrassed about. You know, over the years I've done work, as you have, and I think there's a lot of journalists have done, that pushes the boundaries. But when you're operating in a place that you're familiar with, the political environment that you're familiar with, you start to develop a radar. You start to know where the limits are of what the government will tolerate, how, when you start to stray close to that line, what the consequences might be if you step over that line. In Egypt, I'd only been there for 2 weeks. I'd arrived in Egypt just a little bit before we were arrested, 2 weeks before we were arrested, just to cover the bureau for Al Jazeera over the Christmas New Year period. I'm based in Nairobi. I cover East Africa generally. I know that region pretty well, but I'm not really familiar at all with Egyptian politics, or at least I wasn't at the time. I'm a little more familiar with it now. And when we started work, we were deliberately playing with a straight bat. My intention was not to push the boundaries. You know, there's a kind of standard journalistic trope. You take a quote from the government, then you get a counter quote from the opposition. You achieve some kind of artificial balance. That way both sides get a chance to say their piece, and you walk a fairly straight middle line. It's simply a kind of he said, she said form of dealing with the narrative. Not particularly creative, not inventive, certainly not pushing any boundaries. And so that's really all we were doing. I certainly didn't think that was ever going to be a dangerous thing.
It is made even more galling in a way by the fact that the opposition, when you were ringing the opposition for comment, that opposition had actually been the elected government only a short while before. Not
just the elected government, but the first democratically elected government that Egypt had ever had. Let me give you a bit of a history lesson for those of you who aren't that familiar with Egyptian politics. You remember back in 2011, January 2011, there was a revolution, a popular uprising, particularly focused on Tahrir Square. On the 25th of January, Hosni Mubarak, the long-time military dictator in Egypt, collapsed. His regime collapsed, and there was a period of about a year in which the country was run by the delightfully named SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. They held elections a year later, about 18 months later, the middle of 2012, and the Muslim Brotherhood won that election. Mohamed Morsi became the president. He survived for a year, and there was until the middle of 2013, June 2013, when there was a very big popular uprising, a lot of discontent. The Brotherhood had very little experience in government. They made a lot of very serious mistakes. They'd lost a lot of popular confidence. And the government then appeared and said, look, the military appeared and said, you have to step aside, you've lost the popular support, and here's a gun to sort of underscore that point. And so the president did what you would imagine him to do, and he stepped aside. And that was just 6 months before we arrived. Now, at the time of that coup, if you're a supporter of the Brotherhood, a popular uprising if you're a supporter of the military regime or the government, 6 months later, the Brotherhood had still formed the opposition. It was still the largest, and to my mind, the best organised political force in the country, and it had not yet been formally proscribed. It had not been banned as a terrorist organisation. It had been accused of terrorism, but not actually banned. And so, again, the government of the day, the interim administration, was introducing laws that would explicitly challenge the ability of the Brotherhood to operate. It was limiting the scope for protests and political movements, political opposition.
So nowadays, the words banned Muslim Brotherhood are just, one of those standard tropes. But when they raided you in the Marriott Hotel and they found telephone numbers for people in the Muslim Brotherhood, it was not then the banned Muslim Brotherhood?
No, it had not been formally banned. As I said, it had been accused of being associated with terrorism, but it had not been formally banned.
And what was that day like?
Gosh, it's funny, I can remember it with extreme clarity, but there's also a lot of fuzziness around the edges. It's a strange contradiction. I mean, I remember I was getting dressed to go out for dinner that evening on the 29th of December with an old friend who I hadn't seen for a while, another journalist who had also come in to cover that period. And there was a knock on the door, just a fairly insistent knock, and then a little while later, a much more forceful knock. And I went to open the door, and instantly a bunch of guys flooded in. I don't know how many there were. This is where it starts to get fuzzy. I just remember people coming in, pushing me to the back of the room, rifling through the room. It felt like about 6 or 8 guys, perhaps, who were all in there. no uniforms, no kind of identifying marks. They refused to tell me who they were.
You don't speak Arabic. Were they speaking English to you? There
was one guy who spoke very broken English, just enough to tell me that he wouldn't tell me anything.
So, so a very incredibly confusing situation for you.
Really confusing, really disorienting. Initially, I worried that there might have been a bunch of goons who'd come in to raid the place, but there was a hotel security guy with them, so I figured that wasn't quite what was going on.
There's film of you with Mohammed Fahmy and Baha Mohammed. That must have been a little later then.
No, the film, what happened was, and this, in a way, it was really interesting, it was really quite curious, because what happened was they had, the guys that raided the room had a camera with them, a television camera, or video camera, hosing around the room. And that was actually during the raid itself. And then also down in a police room, or a room that the police had occupied and were using to interrogate us, to question us. And a couple of weeks after our arrest, somebody leaked that video. It was a policeman that was doing the filming, and the police leaked it to one of the more rabid of the talk show hosts, more rabid anti-Muslim Brotherhood talk show hosts, and he presented this as evidence of what he called the Marriott cell at work. And that's what we became known as, the Marriott cell, as if we were somehow some kind of sinister underground unit that was working with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, talk about hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that video was intended to discredit us, and I think in so many ways it showed exactly the opposite, because what people saw were all of the tools of the trade of nothing more sinister and dangerous, given where we are, than a television camera, some microphones, notepads, and so on.
Now, you must be thinking, I know you are, thinking every day, all the time, about Baha and Mohammed, who are now back in jail as of last week. And that brings us to the question of what their conditions are likely to be. Your memories now of those jails that you were in?
Well, let me begin by telling you that prison is never the easiest experience at the best of times, and I dare say Egypt's prisons aren't the best of those prison systems. It varied a lot, and one of the things that I am enormously grateful for, and I want to thank everybody who ever supported us, because the fact that we had so much public support, and pretty much unanimous public support, political support, diplomatic support, support from our professional colleagues, all of that helped, I think, to keep us pretty safe. I know what the conditions were like. The first police cell that I was in was a box about 8 foot square. Now, I don't know how many of you can see this piece of carpet that we're on, but the length of that carpet is probably maybe a little bit longer than 8 feet, I'd say, and the depth of this carpet perhaps a bit shorter. So if you can sort of draw a square around that, and if you imagine a sink in this corner, a little hole for a toilet in that corner, and in the rest of the space you imagine 16 guys. Yeah, 16 guys, and some of them had been in there for about 6 months, 24/7.
Is there room to lie down at all?
Not without feeling the next guy's pulse.
Right, and also without feeling that you're taking up somebody else's space.
Oh, I mean, taking up someone else's space was never an issue. You were always in someone else's space. Right. The concept of personal space is just non-existent. Now, to be fair, I was lucky. I didn't spend a great deal of time in that cell. I was moved fairly swiftly on to another cell, another prison. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but this particular cell was so confined, was so restrictive that you could see what it was doing to people's minds in there. It was quite disturbing to see the way that it was changing the psychology of people. And afterwards I was moved to a prison called Lumen Prison, which was put into solitary confinement for the first 10 days or so, 2 weeks. Not long at all. It was relatively...
Each of you in solitary confinement? Each of the
yes.
three of you in solitary?
Well, yes. Although I was in a separate prison altogether. I was separated from the other guys. They went into a prison called Scorpion, which is as sinister as it sounds. and I went into Lumen. And my neighbours happened to be one side a guy called Allah Abdel Fattah, who is one of Egypt's most prominent youth activists, a brilliant guy, a secular activist, who was right at the very forefront of the January 25th revolution. And there are other guys like Ahmed Meher and Ahmed Doma and Mohammed Adel, who, again, I'm sure these names will mean absolutely nothing to most of you, but these were also guys who were right at the forefront of the January 25th revolution in terms of organising what they called the April 6th movement. The Egyptians love their dates. But these were secular activists that were really pushing for
a democracy.
Pushing for democratic change, yes. I remember speaking to the prosecutor who was interrogating me, and he asked me once where I was being held, and I told him, I said, I'm in a political wing of Lumen Prison. He said, political wing? We don't have political prisoners.
Right. But you talk to them?
Yes.
Is there a sort of prison radio, as it were, where you talk through the grill?
Yes, in fact, and not in the informal way you imagine. We actually organised a very, very structured prison radio. Once the solitary confinement had ended, they relaxed the rules and we were allowed to move around a little bit during the day, and we'd obviously have conversations, but at night what would happen is you were only allowed to visit once every 2 weeks. And so between all of the prisoners, all of the inmates in a particular wing, obviously there would be a visit just about every day. And so we would hold prison radio. Someone would host it, bellowing out through the grill in the windows, in the grill in your door. And you would exchange news and information, gossip. Sometimes we'd have political debates, sometimes ideological discussions. It was an absolutely vital way, partly of exchanging information, but also of staying connected and staying sane.
And you started to learn Arabic in prison. Were these conversations held in English and Arabic, a sort of mixture? Or?
No, one of my neighbours did the translations.
Right.
To my eternal shame, I never really learned, never really got hold of Arabic.
I just remember your parents telling me that there was somebody that you were teaching English and they were teaching you Arabic in return.
Yes, we tried. we worked at it.
It's not easy.
No.
So, just going back to Baha and Mohammed, what do you know about where they are now?
Very little. I know that they're in the Torah complex. We understand it's in the same prison that I was in the last one, which is relatively benign. I think they have a little bit more space than they're in a large communal cell. There are several of them in there. But let me be clear: whatever the conditions are, the fact is that they are imprisoned as innocent men, and they should not be
as innocent men. And for 3 years in one case, for 3 years and 6 months in the other case.
That's right.
The extra 6 months is for having a spent shell in a drawer, I think. Is that?
Yeah, a bullet casing that Baha had picked up off the battlefield as a battlefield souvenir. It was perhaps...
I've very seldom been in a foreign correspondent's office that hasn't got a couple of those, on the mantelpiece or whatever. People keep those as souvenirs.
It's perhaps a little bit naive, but as you say, everyone does it. You go through these environments and you want something as a keepsake, and that's a fairly potent reminder of what we've all been through.
And of that 3 years, is there a time served system?
There is.
So they've already served more than a year of it?
I spent 400 days in prison, and the other guys spent 410 days, I think, before they were released on bail through our first trial.
And is there a parole system?
There is, no, not really. They need to serve the time, unless we get a presidential pardon.
And what are the chances of a presidential pardon, do you think?
I don't know. President Sisi has said several times in the past that if he's given the opportunity, he would give us, if we are sentenced and convicted once more, he will consider a pardon. We've been down this route before. We thought that the retrial, which, as you mentioned, ended last Saturday with convictions and sentences all round, that he would consider a pardon. we thought that they would acquit us. We really thought that they would acquit us. We thought that we would get off. I mean, there was no evidence. And curiously, this is one of those situations where you're very lucky because the evidence that the prosecutor is using against us is by definition a matter of public record. He's accused us of broadcasting false news. And of course, if you're broadcasting, then it's out there, it's online, it's on YouTube. Anybody who wants to look at it is free to Google it, watch it, and decide for themselves if it is wrong, if it is falsified. In the 20 months since we were arrested, nobody has ever been able to demonstrate or show us anything that was falsified, least of all the prosecutor. So we thought that the courts would do the only thing that they could possibly do and acquit us. The fact that they sentenced us once more, convicted us and sentenced us to prison terms once more was really quite shocking. And so we've kind of lost faith in the integrity of the system. But what I'm saying is the President Sisi now has an opportunity to correct this injustice and, well, restore a little bit of faith in the integrity of the system.
How do you react when you see the Egyptian government attacking people who have attacked the verdict in your case as an attack on their justice system? I've got to be very careful because we still are trying to fight this for my colleagues and myself. We want everybody released and acquitted and cleared, have our names clear, because the last thing I want, of course, is a criminal conviction hanging over my head, a criminal record. We think that all of the reaction has come from governments, from human rights groups, from journalists' organisations who monitored the trial, who sat through every single hearing, waiting for some piece of evidence that could perhaps confirm the charges. No one saw anything. It was never presented in court. And so all of the criticism has been directed at the failure of that judgment. My argument simply is that if the Egyptians are concerned about, and particularly if President Sisi is concerned about the criticism, then he will correct the mistake. But you yourself are in a Kafkaesque situation because you were expelled from the country and then the justice system called you back to testify on your own behalf. Yeah. What happened when you tried to do that?
Well, this is one of those things where we're arguing that this was a failure of natural justice. I've been denied natural justice. As you know, as any lawyer knows, that the most fundamental principle of law is that an accused person should be allowed to defend themselves. Now, I was deported from Egypt on a presidential decree. I'm not on the run. I'm not a fugitive. I'm not trying to evade justice. I wasn't in court because the president ordered me out. And yet the court declared me as on trial in absentia. And I recognised the dilemma that this put them in, so I offered to appear by video link. We made the offer privately. We made it through diplomatic channels, and I also then made it publicly. And we never once had a response to those offers. What I wanted to do was to cooperate with the court. I mean, we've done nothing wrong, so I'm happy to explain what we did and why and how we came to how we produced the stories that we did and explain all of defend myself against all of the allegations, and the court didn't respond to that. So my argument is, and my appeal to the government is, look, in the interest of natural justice, I've been denied that opportunity.
Baha and Mohammed were out for some months on bail. What can you imagine their state of mind on the day of the appeal failing, when they were behind that cage and they were just whisked back, and that was the end of their freedom?
Yeah, what happened was that they were taken. They had a chance to say goodbye to their families going into the cage. I'm sure most of you who watch television would have seen some of the pictures, the images of the cage behind which the defendants sit. And it's always a horrible feeling going in there. They would have said goodbye to their families. Baher has 3 young children, including a 1-year-old baby boy who celebrated his first birthday on the Saturday before the verdict, the Friday before the verdict, rather. Fahmy has a wife. They've been married only literally a few weeks. And so it would have been a very difficult goodbye, but I don't think they would have said goodbye ever anticipating this particular verdict. And so once the hammer dropped, they were whisked straight out the back of the cage and straight into prison. And so being torn away from their families, particularly when you know what you've got to go into, you've had a taste of that relationship and the connections, it's an incredibly tough wrench.
What's their physical health like?
As far as I can tell, okay, but I don't really know at this point. We've had very little contact, very little communication.
You don't know whether they've got access to medications and so forth?
If they're in the prison that I think they are, they should have access to doctors, but I don't have enough information to give you any definitive answer.
That takes us back to the beginning of your story in the prison. How long was it before any news from outside began to filter into you?
It slowly, well, I started to have visits from the embassy, the Australian embassy, and slowly we started to we were getting information from those visits. People were starting to get some sense of the public response to what was happening to us. And I felt that I started to hear word, we started to get word of a letter writing campaign, of some of the responses of our professional colleagues. We never really understood, though, Mark. I don't think I ever really appreciated just how extraordinary the level of support really was. And remember, I remember my parents coming in, my family coming in, and they said, look, you don't get it. You don't understand just what's going on out there. And I'd humour them. I'd say, well, of course I don't understand. You know, I mean, you're right, I'm sure I don't. But in my own mind, I'm thinking I'm a journalist, like you, and I'm thinking, well, of course I get how this thing works. I know what's going on. I know there's a public campaign and stuff. I had absolutely no idea.
There's a book just published of letters to you. Did all of those letters get to you?
No, they were, I mean, at one point, my family started to bring in letters and the authorities were relenting. The rules say that you're only allowed 2 or 3 letters a month. And so what my family would do, the Egyptians, the prison authorities weren't that great at reading English. And so my parents would take some of the letters that we got from the public and kind of stitch them together and bring in a 16-page letter and say, here, here's one. And so I was able to get quite a lot, but we got literally thousands and thousands of letters from people. The Free AJ Staff hashtag got, and I'm not kidding, 3 billion impressions. Billion with a B. Now, I know my family alone would have been responsible for about 1 billion of those, but
I love your family. One of the few good things to come out of this for me was getting to know your family. They're wonderful. And it was a hell of a journey for them too.
Oh yeah, look. And before we get on to the family, there is something else I do want to say, and I'm going to take this opportunity because we are talking about the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. And one of the things that I think for the politicians and the authorities, and I know this for a fact, I've spoken to a number of diplomats who said, look, one of the reasons that they were able to speak to the Egyptians with authority was because there was this massive groundswell of popular outrage at what had happened to us. I know when you hit like or you retweet a tweet or you engage with a hashtag or something, it probably feels very small and insignificant, and in each individual's way, perhaps it is. But this is one of those moments when the collective really has enormous power. The politicians were able to be unanimous in their support for us, and they were able to say with authority to the Egyptians in bilateral meetings, look, I'd love to be able to engage with you, but we can't because we've got all of our constituents on our backs, on our asses, telling us that we can't talk to you, that we mustn't deal with you, we must isolate you because of what you've done. And although for strategic reasons we might want to, we can't be appearing to have any relationship with you because of what you guys have done. So once you sort that out, we can then deal with you. And so you need to understand, I get quite cynical about social media in a lot of ways, but in this particular instance and in so many instances, it really did have an enormous impact. And I really do want to thank everybody that ever engaged with us up to now. I would not be here, I'm telling you, if it weren't for that support. I know we still have a fight, and that's why I would also ask everybody out there to keep tweeting the hashtag FreeAJStaff, to keep reminding, keep talking about this. Now, you mentioned the family. Sorry.
Go on, no.
No, well, that's the other thing. I wouldn't be on this stage either because...
Just to bridge through that, one of the things that the family did, which actually helped to add to that tide that you were talking about, was to help you get letters out. Tell us about how you did that.
Yeah, this is... After I was telling you, you remember I mentioned Allah Abdel Fattah, one of the guys in the first prison in Lumen. And one of the things that we realized was that, in discussing it, I couldn't quite understand what was going on because I knew we had done nothing wrong. And I didn't understand why we should be in prison. There was no evidence, absolutely nothing. We weren't, as I said, we weren't crossing any lines. We weren't sailing close to any of those lines, legal or ethical. And so the closer I looked at it, the more I realized this wasn't, in my view, this wasn't about us. The Egyptian authorities were going to frame, or the prosecutor was going to frame this as something that we had done, some wrong that we had committed. They were going to look and pick through all of the work that we had produced in forensic detail. I knew that we had nothing there, but I didn't want to play that narrative. I realized that in my mind, in the absence of any evidence, the only reason we could have been there was because they wanted to send a message about press freedom. They wanted to intimidate every journalist that was working in Egypt. They chose us because we were politically convenient, but ultimately this was about controlling the press, silencing the press. And so I wrote the letters, 2 letters, in which I said that this is, I framed it in those details. I wanted to make sure that our supporters, that the family wanted to know and understand that this was about press freedom. I didn't think those letters would have any impact at all. I can't tell you at this point, I'm afraid, how I got those letters out, those initial letters out, but we did. I didn't think they would have any impact, to be honest with you. I thought that they might go up on a website somewhere, perhaps some radical newspaper might publish them, my family might have put them out, but I didn't think they'd have much of an impact at all.
Well, they did. They certainly did. I'll just mention at this point that there are microphones set up there, and over here and over here. And in a few minutes, we'll start taking questions. So if you'd like to ask Peter a question, please start queuing up at the microphones there. Can I just ask you also about, because we're talking about freedom of speech of journalists, but it is actually a much broader issue of freedom of speech in general, which takes us back to those people that you met in the prison. Now, clearly there are people in those prisons who have done bad things. There are people who have done bad things in prisons all over the world. But how many people do you think there are in Egyptian prisons who you would classify as being there for free speech reasons?
Mark, I can't answer that question. I mean, I can't answer it with any accuracy or integrity. What bothers me is that we're seeing journalism itself. I mean, journalism is under fire. Egypt is probably the most polarized, or one of the most polarized places I've ever been in that isn't locked in a civil war. And it's interesting. There were a lot of guys who I met, Islamists, in prison, and also the secular guys who would say to me, listen, we're in here because of our beliefs, because of our opinions. We tried a revolution. We held the uprising on January 25th in 2011. We went out in the streets, we toppled a dictator, We did what the West wanted. We tried democracy, and look where it got us. And they said, what are we supposed to do? How else are we supposed to respond? We've got no choice but to rise up and fight. And what bothers me is that in clamping down on freedom of expression, in clamping down on the ability of the media in particular to engage in these conversations, we're giving those people in the middle no space to move. We're giving them nowhere else to go. You're either with the government or, as George W. Bush mentioned, you're either with us or you are with the terrorists. Now, so many of these guys, and please understand, I'm not endorsing this for a second. I'm simply doing a journalist's job and relaying what they're saying. They said to me, Nelson Mandela was the head of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation, the ANC's military wing. The ANC actively decided to launch an uprising, a military uprising, a guerrilla campaign against the apartheid state to drive the state to negotiate. They said, if it's good for Nelson Mandela, why isn't it good for us? Now, I recognise that there are all sorts of I'm not suggesting again that they're equivalent to Nelson Mandela, but in their eyes, that's the decision that they have. That's the binary choice that they've got to make, because that space to discuss, to debate, to argue, to have any kind of political opposition has vanished.
It's worth noting there also that the man who heads Al-Qaeda now, the successor to bin Laden, was imprisoned as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood under Sadat. And a lot of where Al-Qaeda came from was inside Egypt's prisons. Can you see how that would happen, that the prisons become, as it were, universities of revolution? It's
almost a cliche now. That that the prisons do allow these kinds of conversations and increasing radicalisation to take place. But it's not, in a way, the prisons, I'm worried about the prisons, but of course, what worries me is more the whole issue of the public debate, of the public space. The prisons allow radicalisation because they create quite literally a self-contained silo where these ideas start to circulate. What concerns me is that if you tamp down the ability of the press to engage in these kinds of discussions, to interrogate the extremes right across the political spectrum, as much as to keep track of what governments do, then what you do is that you force people into radicalised silos. And I think that the internet tends to do that as much as anything else. If we can't have these conversations in the open, if we can't use the disinfecting qualities of daylight through the press, through the mainstream media, then, as we've learnt to our cost, these kinds of debates tend to disappear into the silos, into virtual silos on the internet. And what we see is a kind of these self-reinforcing loops within those communities, and we end up with more radicalisation, not less.
Okay, let's take a question. Let's start up at that microphone up there.
Microphone, you need to say the microphone.
This one?
Yep, it's microphone 3.
Yeah, my name's Brian Concannon. While you were locked up, Peter, I had all signs in my window in Manly. I had a prominent position there saying, "Release Peter Greste. The war on terror is manufactured. Egypt is a terrorist. The war on terror... journalism isn't a crime," amongst various things. And then you got out, thank God.
Thank you.
Just keep it fairly short and make it a question.
Democracy is a joke. Like Egypt democratically elected its own government and they were ousted in a coup.
Could you make it a question?
Same things happened in Syria.
Could you make it a question, please?
It's not part of the one world government.
Could you make it a question?
You and your colleagues were jailed as part of the Rothschilds' one world government agenda.
No, okay. Thank you. You're not going to make a question, you're going to make a statement. Can you sit down? Over there. Thanks.
G'day, and courage and fantastic story, and thank you for doing what you do. I'm interested in what you think of the limitations on journalists in saying what they really think, and whether there is pressure from governments not to say things like the Tony Abbott's, you know, we're having a jihad against the government, ABC and SMH having a jihad against the government, the monopoly control over media outlets, the money involved. Are journalists self-censoring themselves? Is there a problem in terms of saying what you think as a journalist?
Okay, it sounds like a fairly straightforward question, but it's an incredibly complicated one. Let me start by debunking the myth of objectivity. There's no such thing as objective news, as objective journalism. Every time you produce a story, you make subjective choices about how you approach the story. Who you talk to, who you don't talk to is a subjective choice. The questions you ask, the questions you don't ask. All of these things are subjective. You have an opinion. It filters through into, your perspective, your worldview defines the way you construct a story. The problem is that what's happening at the moment is because of, in my view, the twin pressures of the commercial pressures that are now on journalists because of the way that the business models have been disrupted by the internet, have meant that we're under enormous pressure to be vastly more commercial in what we produce. We have to justify what we do commercially in ways that we never did before. The internet has also tended to polarize public opinion. It tends to kind of push things, I think, more and more to the extremes, and I think that's reflected in what's often published, particularly in the newspapers. But I also think that the war on terror itself, God, I hate that term. There was a friend that very wryly described it as the war on an abstract noun. What this means is, what it does is that it, as I said before, it creates this binary choice, a space where there's no room to operate. There's no neutral middle ground in which journalists are able to safely interrogate. Mark was talking earlier about the way that journalists have been becoming increasingly under attack. And Mark, you started back in Bosnia, but I think the real assaults on journalism really began after 9/11, when what that did was that we saw a conflict evolve not over stuff, not over physical, tangible things, but over an idea and a worldview. And in that argument over a worldview, in an argument over an idea, it's the purveyors that become the battleground. Media is the space in which this war is being waged. Look at the way that Islamic State has been using YouTube and Twitter to recruit its supporters, to terrify people, far more than they ever would have done in the past. And so journalists, because we work in that space, become the targets. Now, in the eyes of the government, what's happening, I think, is that we're seeing the war on terror used as an excuse to try and marginalise or try and shut down the kind of opposition, the kind of interrogation of the things that we would normally be allowed to do, we might have been able to do in the past, but in the name of national security, and I'm very concerned about that. That's microphone one, I think.
Hello?
Yeah.
It's on. My name's Lydia and I'm a young journalism student, and I'd just like to say that both of you are amazing role models for the next generation of journalists coming through. My question is to you, Peter. If you could go back, would you do everything the same? Are you glad that you told that story, or do you wish that you just never went to Egypt?
Look, that assumes that I'd have a choice. Would I do anything differently knowing what I know now? No, I don't think I would have. And in a funny way, I've got a lot to thank the Egyptians for. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. I don't mean this facetiously, and I don't mean it in a glass half full kind of way. I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy what we went through in prison. It was a horrible, terrifying experience. But equally, if our case has done anything, it's brought you lot out here to listen to a talk today about journalistic freedom. It's right up there. And to my mind, as I've just been saying, this is under attack. This is something that we need to defend. And journalism gets a really bad rap at the moment. Everyone gets very cynical about journalists. I think the reputation of journalists is right up there with used car salesmen.
And politicians.
And politicians.
Actual polls.
And so if we have an opportunity through, and what this case has done is made people understand and think about why what we do is important to our democracy. It's kind of helped strip away some of the cynicism just for a few moments. I understand where it comes from. I'm not trying to excuse some of the excesses of our business. But the reason I wrote those letters in the first place was because I wanted to frame this as the defence of something fundamental to democracy, something as a defence of a fundamental right. And because I now have a stage and a microphone and audiences, then I think it's been able to turn that into something much more productive. I'm still very concerned. My primary role is still to try and get my colleagues out of prison and to clear our names. But in the process, I do feel, as I said, that something positive has come from this, and I really hope we can keep this conversation going.
Yeah, I'd just add very briefly to that we've seen in the last 48 hours, we've seen the most extraordinary example where the one photograph, or the photograph of one small child drowned, washed up on a beach, and then the story of his family and how they were fleeing from Kobani in Kurdistan, which was overrun by ISIS, has done more. It's one of the things that journalism does, is to use the stories of individuals to illuminate an issue. It's done more to tell people what is going on there and what this refugee crisis means than just about anything. Maybe it shouldn't be that way. Maybe when we see the phrase 11 million people dead, displaced, or dead refugees or internally displaced, maybe we should have more of a response straight away to that figure of 11 million. But in fact, what we relate to is other human beings, other individuals, and at its best, that's what journalism does. So that's my little bit there. We'll have another go at microphone 3. Oh, please.
Hi, Peter. My name's Sasha. Thank you for coming. You've really been the highlight of the festival for me and lots of people in this room, I imagine. I've wanted to be a foreign correspondent since I found out what ambitions were. That desire is still there. I'm in my final year at the moment. And I just wanted to ask you if you have any tips for me and aspiring other young journalists, particularly for females such as myself who are interested in corresponding from dangerous areas.
Gosh, I've
Lots
had this.
of words, I know. Sorry.
I've had this question a few times, and it gives me, it actually puts chills down my spine because you're choosing a time that I think has never been tougher to enter the industry. We were talking earlier, Mark, again about the risks that journalists face, and Freedom House has done, the CPJ, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, has done its sums, and it reckons that the last 3 years were the worst on record for journalist deaths. I think last year, we had something like 60 that were killed on the job or because of their work in some way. And so I believe we need foreign correspondents. One of the problems that we have is a loss of support for foreign news in Australia, and that worries me deeply. And so we need people with ambition. We need people with passion and courage to go out and cover these things. But it is a very, very difficult thing to do. I would say, do as I say, not as I did, because I did that stupid thing. I went off to Bosnia. That was my first war as a young freelance. I survived it. God knows how I managed to make it through in one piece. But the moment, what you need to do, what you absolutely have to do, and there are a number of, there's a big effort. We're trying to push very hard now to create some standards and ethics about the way that news organisations work with freelancers, to make sure that they only take work from freelancers who have the training. Unless you have the certified training in hostile environments, they won't take a piece from you. I'm very pleased about that because I think it is incredibly dangerous. You need to, as far as possible, work with the support of established agencies. And again, that doesn't help you if you're trying to make a name for yourself, particularly with organisations that don't have a lot of money. I don't have a clear answer. I don't have any clear tips for you because this is a very different world from the one that I entered. I'm sorry about that. I just say to you, and God, I wish I didn't have to say this on a stage like this, but particularly as a female, you've got a lot against you, but at the same time, it is an extraordinary business.
And don't forget that Marie Colvin, who no relation, but whom I knew, was for many, and she did die in Syria, and that sounds like a cautionary tale, but actually for decades she was one of the finest Middle East correspondents alive. She was an absolutely extraordinary person, and in fact, I think for a long time there have been quite a lot of women journalists in the Middle East who've done extremely well. One reason is that Western women journalists kind of play with the Arabic mindset in a way that they don't necessarily quite know how to deal with. I've seen women journalists get better access in the Middle East sometimes than men.
Lise Doucette is a classic.
Sorry?
Lise Doucette, the BBC.
Lise Doucette is an extraordinary journalist. Yeah. Let's take number 4.
My question's for Peter. Do you worry about what you say at public forums such as these may impact negatively on your colleagues still in Egypt? And if so, how do you reconcile that with your journalistic duty to speak out?
I'm not quite sure if I'm going to make things worse by acknowledging this, but I have been fairly circumspect in what I've been saying today. One of the things that the court accused us of, not just accused us of, but convicted all of us of, was not being legitimate journalists. What I'm hoping that I can do by standing on a stage in front of a sign that says journalistic freedom is perhaps underscore the point that might have been a flawed judgment. I am very careful about what I say. We need to make sure, and we need to remind Egypt of why this matters, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not critical of all of Egypt. I know this ring, I wear a ring here. This is an Egyptian ring, and I wear it to remind myself that it's not Egypt that put me in prison, it's a couple of judges that did it. There are institutional flaws that did it. So what I'm trying to do is use these forums to remind Egypt of why these issues matter. The journalistic freedom is written into Egypt's own constitution. As I mentioned, President Sisi has an opportunity. I'm trying to encourage him to take those opportunities. You're right that there is a risk that these forums might actually make things worse. I'm hoping that this keeps up the public pressure, that people are aware of it, that we keep up the pressure on politicians to talk to diplomats and in turn talk to the Egyptians to remind them why this matters. There was never an easy answer for us in terms of the campaign. I just hope and pray that we might be able to the pressure that I'm able to bring to bear might actually help the situation. I can't be sure that it might also harm it, but you can't do nothing.
I'm afraid the clock's running down on us, so I think this will have to be the last question here.
Just before the verdict was handed down at your retrial, your colleagues were, or one of your colleagues was speaking quite openly about the potential omissions of Al Jazeera and how that may have contributed to the allegations against you and to your convictions. So my question is, I suppose, how do you exercise journalistic freedom in an environment where journalists may be compromised or adversely positioned by the publications they work for?
Look, it is a very good question. And it's a question that I'm sure anyone who ever worked for News Limited, Murdoch Press, is often asked as well, or the ABC. My argument has always been that whatever the politics of the proprietors and whatever the issues have been between the Egyptian government and Qatar or Al Jazeera, those issues need to be worked out at that level between the government and the network, or the government and government to government. What we were on trial, it was the three of us that were on trial, not Al Jazeera. There were a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of arguments about what was going on at that level, but I've always said that if that was your issue, then that was the level at which it should have been dealt with. I've always stood by the work that we did. I was more than happy. The reason I offered to appear by video link was because I was more than happy to defend my journalism. I stand by the integrity of my work. And in fact, I think the reason we got so much public support was because over time people recognized that based on my record, based on the records of all of us that were accused in this case, there was nothing in our professional records to suggest that we had ever worked with anything other than complete professionalism and integrity. In a way, our commitment to our ethics actually saved us, I think. Because if anything had ever come up about the work that we'd produced, we would have been, the confidence in our defence would have fallen apart, our support would have crumbled, and we'd have been still in prison. So all you can do is work to those old-fashioned principles, journalistic principles of accuracy, of fairness, of balance, of integrity. That's it. The politics of your proprietor is something that you're always going to be dragged into, and as I mentioned earlier, you can't avoid that. It's a fact of the life of what we do. We have to, we're owned by big organisations or financed by governments. The way the business works at the moment, you can't possibly run a news organisation unless you have very deep pockets and you can afford to lose a lot of money. So that's the world that we live in. As an individual journalist, we live or stand by the work that we produce. I stand by that. As I said, I don't think I'd be here if I couldn't.
Thank you, Peter. The clock's run down on us and we have to go. But thank you all so much for coming. I hope you all, if you are on social media, keep on using the hashtag FreeAJStaff. I hope you keep on doing whatever you can to try and support our colleagues in jail in Egypt, but also try and keep in mind that whenever you read a foreign news story, it's been brought to you by somebody who may well have put themselves in danger, whether it's in the danger of being jailed or tortured or killed, and that journalism in general is working under increasing pressure. We are now, even in Australia, outnumbered. Journalists are now outnumbered by PR people, and they are not as toxic as people with guns, but they do make the job more difficult. Thank you all so much for coming. Greste.